Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our shir. Thank you for joining us. This is a new shir that we are going to be giving from time to time, and the title is Halacha in the Headlines. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking different issues that are out there in the media, both in Israel and abroad, and looking at them through the perspective of Halacha, what Jewish law has to say about these matters, about these issues. And the topic of tonight's discussion is about ascending the Temple Mount, the Har Habayis, and about the possibility of having a shul, having a beis haknesses, a synagogue built on Har Habayis in the present day times. So to really set the stage for this discussion, let's just talk about what's going on in the world at the moment, particularly in the Holy Land. Over the last few years, probably the last decade or so, we've seen increasing numbers of Jewish people visiting the Temple Mount. Now, that is only a possibility that happened from 1967 and onwards, after the Six-Day War, when the Jewish people conquered Har Habayis. So from then on, it became the possibility of actually going up onto the Temple Mount. And therefore, that brought to the fore a discussion amongst the poskim, amongst the Halachic authorities, as to the permissibility of doing so. And what we're actually witnessing right now is a shifting trend, that whereas it tended to be almost accepted across the board that we do not go up onto the Temple Mount nowadays, over the recent years, there's been an increase in the numbers of we're not discussing non-Orthodox Jews or non-Jewish visitors to the Temple Mount. Here we're talking about Shomrei Torah Mitzvah, halachically observant Jews who are very, very observant when it comes to all matters of halacha, and in increasing numbers, not just from the religious Zionist segment of the Israeli population, but already starting to see members of what we would say is the traditional Haredi community also ascending Har Habayis in much larger numbers, to the extent that there are tour groups that go up, tour groups run by the Temple Institute and other such establishments, to enable religious Jews to ascend Har Habayis in a halachically acceptable manner. Now, on the political front, this has created quite a storm, and I'm sure everyone has heard the term the status quo on the Temple Mount. What does that refer to? That's referring to the issue of Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount. And we've all seen scenes of policemen arresting Jewish visitors to Har Habayis for bowing down, for praying, even silent prayers on their lips. And this goes back to 1967 itself. The general who led the conquest, Moshe Dayan, after the victory, after the famous words, Har Habayis b'yadeinu, that the Temple Mount is in our hands, the Kotel Ma'aravi b'yadeinu, the Western Wall is in our hands. So there was a lot of discussion, well, what now? And one of the very vociferous individuals at that time was the chief rabbi of the army, Rav Goren. Rav Shlomo Goren wanted, at that point in time, to pave the way for the third Beis Hamikdash, that he said now is the opportune time to remove the mosque from the Temple Mount. And it's believed that he had plans and a desire to build a shul on Har Habayis where Jewish people would be able to go up and pray. Now, Moshe Dayan, who was not really considered a religious individual, was a politician with political considerations, was infuriated with this, even entertaining this possibility. You could imagine the political outcome or fallout from such a decision. And after conquering the Temple Mount, he subsequently made an arrangement with what we know as the Waqf, which is the trustees of the Temple Mount, governed by the Jordanians, and he gave control of the Har Habayis, of administering the religious sites of the Temple Mount, which really at that time and nowadays is only mosques. The administration was given over in a de facto sense to the Waqf, and they're the ones who control the goings-on at Har Habayis, albeit that there is Israeli security presence. But the second thing he agreed to as part of that was to forbid Jewish worship on the Temple Mount. The Jewish people would not be able to go up and to daven, would not be able to go and bow down. This is an ancient minhag that when people would visit the Beis Hamikdash, there was a mitzvah to prostrate oneself, to bow down on the Temple Mount at various places. and he made an agreement that this would be forbidden and would be policed by Israeli police officers on the Temple Mount. And so therefore, when we talk about this status quo, the status quo on the Temple Mount was to forbid Jewish worship. And sadly, this was not imposed on us as it was in previous times by other governments and other religions. This was coming from within the Jewish government itself in the Holy Land of Israel. But as time has gone on and more people are ascending Har Habayis, the idea of people davening on Har Habayis and bowing down on Har Habayis is becoming more and more common. Of course, it's done out of the view of the Muslim population on the Temple Mount, but you can find photos and pictures and documentation of people going up onto the Temple Mount, nowadays davening, nowadays prostrating themselves, and the police generally turn a blind eye unless there's a feeling that this might cause some form of a security matter. And what really triggered the discussion in the global setting was Israeli politicians going up onto Har Habayis, because that's not just ordinary civilians, but is seen to represent the view of the government in Israel. And most recently, we have one of the members of the government in Israel, ben-gvir, who's a very staunchly right-wing politician, and very much believes that the Jewish people should have authority and autonomy over the Har Habayis, and that there should not be this blatant discrimination where Jewish people are not allowed to pray on their most holy of sites. So he has and frequently goes up onto the Temple Mount, most recently on the day of Tisha B'Av itself, the day that we are mourning the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, together with other group of people, and they engaged in prayer. And afterwards he said that there is nothing forbidden about Jews praying on the Temple Mount, that it's a perfectly legal matter. And he is alleged to have said that if he could, he would want to build a shul, a synagogue on the Har Habayis for Jewish people to go up there and to daven. And of course, this triggered a whole big worldwide conflagration that people labeled him as this hawkish, right-wing, radical, fanatic, messianic Kahanist who is there to cause provocation and destabilize the region by visits to the Temple Mount. But of course, it's a crazy idea that we know that this is the holiest of places to the Jewish people. It is the only place which has Kedusha on that level, and that is the site of our temple, the site of the Karbonis, etc. And it's the most holy site of the Jewish people. It always has been and always will be. Whereas in the Quran, which is the text of the Islamic faith, does not mention Yerushalayim even once. Their holy places are in Saudi Arabia. So the idea of this ludicrous situation where Jewish people do not have the freedom of worship on the Har Habayis is very, very bizarre. But what we're looking at is not the political ramifications and implications of going up onto Har Habayis, of having a shul on Har Habayis. We're interested in the halachic basis. As you would have noticed, that in the aftermath of ben-gvir's visit to the Har Habayis, Haredi newspapers, Haredi publications published in Arabic disclaimers saying that Jewish law categorically forbids going up onto the Temple Mount, and therefore this action was wrong, that it's against the accepted opinion of the rabbis, it's against the Torah, and this generally, since 1967, was the position adopted by the great poskim. The great poskim, as we're going to see some of them tonight, they took the view that nowadays we are not able to go up onto Har Habayis. What we need to do is we need to reconcile this with historical accounts prior, going back 1,500 years, 1,000 years, where we do see great rabbis who seem to have gone up onto Har Habayis, have gone up onto Temple Mount, and to worship over there. And so we need to reconcile that with the approach or attitude taken by the contemporary poskim, saying that one should not do so nowadays. And then with regards to the idea of an official synagogue, a shul on Har Habayis, we will hopefully look at some halachic, possibly precedents, historical precedents for such a thing as well. We know that after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash remains in force. And that being the case, all of the halachic obligations of one going up onto the Temple Mount, which includes the restrictions of where and when a person may go into any given area or zone within the temple precincts, remains in force nowadays. And that's why the real topic about going up to Har Habayis revolves around the laws of Tumah V'Tara, the laws of purity and impurity. Generally speaking, aside from the laws of nida, which also affect the interrelationship of husband and wife, all of the other laws of purity and impurity, except for the kohen who cannot have contact with the dead, the other laws of purity and impurity basically became irrelevant, because it was only relevant if one was going to visit the Beis Hamikdash or bring korbanos, bring sacrifices. And therefore, it was really not an issue. But once the possibility of going up onto the Har Habayis, the Temple Mount, became a possibility once more, that brought to the fore the discussion about the laws of Tumah V'Tara, the laws of the different types of purity and impurity that would affect and restrict and limit if and where on Har Habayis a person would be able to go. So what we'll do is quickly just run through a few of the categories of the laws of purity and impurity, because that is completely bound up with temple and with the temple life and ascending onto the Har Habayis. And again, Tumah is a spiritual condition. It's a spiritual status that can be conferred by different interactions with different objects or different emissions that come from a person's body. And each one has its own governing halacha. The most severe type of tumah that we talk about is tumas meis, impurity that comes from contact with the dead. And today, every single person is considered to have that status of impurity from the contact of the dead, which does not only mean physical contact. It can mean visiting a cemetery. It can mean being in the same building as someone who's passed away, which is very applicable in hospitals and the like. And the only remedy for tumas meis, the only way a person can become purified from contact with the dead or tumas meis, is through the ashes of the para aduma, the red heifer, which we no longer have. And therefore, each one of us has the status of tumas meis, and there is no way for us nowadays to get out of it. But then there are other types of tumah as well. We have, as mentioned before, the tumah of a nida, or very similarly a zava. The male counterpart of that is a zav. We have the laws of a metzoira, someone who had tsaras, often translated, but inaccurately so, as leprosy, and tumah that can come from contact with certain animals, sherets. All of these confer different types of tumah. When a man emits seed, a balkari, that also confers the law of tumah. And depending on what type of impurity a person has, that will create a limitation or a restriction on what areas of the Beis Hamikdash one was able to go into. The Mishnah in Masechta Kilayim tells us that there are 10 different levels of holiness when we talk about land. So the land of Eretz Yisrael is holier than Chutz La'aretz, is holier than the land outside of Eretz Yisrael. Within Eretz Yisrael, walled cities are holier than non-walled cities. Amongst them, Yerushalayim, the city of Jerusalem, is holier than other cities. The Har Habayis, the Temple Mount, is holier than the rest of the city of Yerushalayim. And then as we move further into the compound of the Beis Hamikdash, one went into higher and higher realms of Kedusha. Of course, the pinnacle being the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which could only be accessed by the Kohen Gadol one day a year on Yom Kippur. Then we have the Kodesh, the Heichal, where we have the Menorah and the Shulchan, etc., which could only be entered by Kohanim at the time of their Avodah. We then have the area between the Beis Hamikdash and the Mizbeach, where only a Kohen was free of a blemish was allowed to go. Then we have the rest of the Azara, the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, where a Yisrael was able to go, provided they were pure, in order to offer the sacrifices. And then around that, we had the Ezras Nashim, which was an additional courtyard, which existed in the second Beis Hamikdash. And then finally, we had the plateau of the Har Habayis. Now, the Har Habayis, the Temple Mount itself, when one looks in the writings of Chazal, measured 500 by 500 amas. So it's not a huge area. It's about 250 meters by 250 meters, which is far smaller than the area of Har Habayis nowadays, about 3 or 4 times that size. The area which one looks at Har Habayis was an area which historically was extended in the times of King Herod. King Herod made a big renovation on the Beis Hamikdash, which included broadening the area of the Har Habayis itself. Now, the Har Habayis is also a holy place. It's not as holy as the courtyard, as the Azara, but it is certainly holier than the rest of the city of Yerushalayim. And depending which zone one went into, depending what the level of holiness of that place was, there were greater and greater restrictions on who could enter there, and if a person with a certain type of tumah, type of impurity, was allowed to enter those areas. The areas where a person was allowed to enter or not allowed to enter is based on the psukim that describe the camp of the Jewish people in the desert, found in Bamidbar Perek Hey. The camp of the Jewish people in the desert was basically made up of 3 rectangular areas. In the center of the camp, the epicenter, was the Mishkan, and that was the Machane Shechina. That is referred to as the camp of the Shechina. Around that camped the Levium, the three families of the Levium, plus Moshe and Aaron and their families, and that is known as the Machane Leviah, the camp of the Levites. And then around that, we had the tribes on the four sides, three on each side, and that is the Machane Yisrael, the camp of the Israelites. And depending on which type of tumah a person had, would limit which camp they were allowed to go into. Once they came to Yerushalayim, those three camps were transposed to the city of Yerushalayim. So the city of Yerushalayim itself is the counterpart to the Machane Yisrael, the camp of the Yisrael. The Har Habayis, the Temple Mount, is the counterpart to the Machane Leviah, the camp of the Levites. And the Mishkan itself, the Beis HaMikdash, and the Azara, the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, corresponded to the Mishkan, which is the Machane Shechina. When we talk about the applicability of the laws of Tumah V'Tara, we find something interesting, that on one hand, Tumas Meis is considered the strictest type of Tumah, Avi Avois HaTumah. Nonetheless, someone who had Tumas Meis, and not just someone with Tumas Meis, but even a dead body itself, was allowed onto Har Habayis, was allowed in the Machane Levi. And we learned this from the fact that when Moshe left Mitzrayim, Vayikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef imoi, he took the bones of Yosef together with him in his camp. It was in the camp of the Levites. So therefore, we learned from this that a dead body and someone with Tumas Meis is allowed in the Machane Levi, which transfers to the Har Habayis, transfers to the Temple Mount. Whereas someone who had Saras, for example, had to be sent out of all three camps, and they were not even allowed in the city of Yerushalayim. The people with Saras had to be on the outside. But the vast majority of the types of Tumah, a Nida, a Zav, a Zava, a Yoledus, a woman who was given birth, was allowed in Yerushalayim, in the Machane Yisrael, but they were not allowed in the Machane Leviah. They were not allowed in the camp of the Levites, i.e. they were not allowed onto the Temple Mount. So the first consideration is that anyone who has that level of tumah, which can be purified through it going to a mikveh in the proper prescribed manner, was not allowed or would not be allowed onto the Temple Mount categorically. Those who have tumas meis, which nowadays is all of us, whilst we would not be allowed to go in the area which would correspond to the Machane Shechina, which is the area of the temple itself, the Azara and the Heichal, would be allowed to go up onto the Har Habayis, onto the Temple Mount. There are other categories as well, which is the Balkeri. There's a discussion about where they are forbidden to go, but generally it's accepted that they are also forbidden anywhere on the Har Habayis, anywhere on the Temple Mount. As an extra rabbinic safeguard, we read about, the Rambam tells us in the Hilchos Beis HaBechira, based on the Mishnayos and Masechta Mitos, that around the temple, meaning around the Azara, the courtyard of the temple, was an area called the Chel. The Chel is often translated as the ramparts, while some explain that it was a wall, most explain that it was an elevated level. It would go up a series of stairs, and it was an elevated platform that surrounded the outside of the Azara, the courtyard. As a rabbinic safeguard, the rabbis instituted that someone who had tumas meis was not allowed to go past the chel, past this area. Even though biblically they were allowed there, they just weren't allowed into the area of the Azara, but there was a rabbinic injunction. Further, they also made a prescription that a non-Jew was not allowed to go past the chel either. What's interesting, we say in the pasuk, Ki beisi beis tefillah liyikare l'chol ha'amim. Hashem says that my house, the Beis HaMikdash, is a house of prayer for all of the nations of the world. A non-Jew was allowed to go up onto the Har Habayis. A non-Jew could send korbanos to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash on their behalf. But they were not allowed into the chel. Recently, archaeologically, you could see it in Eretz Yisrael. I believe it's in the Israel Museum. They found in the precincts of Har Habayis a tablet where it was inscribed in Greek that a foreigner, a non-Jew, is not allowed to go past this point. So they would have had warning markers saying where each person was or was not allowed to go. So this area of the chel was an extra safeguard so that someone who had tumas meis was not allowed to go into that area at all. So that all was really effective when the Beis HaMikdash was standing. What about after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed? So the Rambam famously is of the opinion that the Kedusha, the sanctity of Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash never departed, even at the time of the destruction of the first temple. And that is because its Kedusha was imbued by the Shechina from above, from on high. And therefore the Kedusha, the sanctity, remains in force even after the Beis HaMikdash has been destroyed. And we derive this from a pasuk which says, "Vashimoisi es mikdashechem." I will destroy your sanctuaries, from which Chazal learn that even when they are destroyed, they are still called mikdashechem. They're still called holy places, meaning the Kedusha remains in force. Another limud, another source of this is the pasuk which says, "As shabsoisai tishmoru, ves mikdashi tishmoru." You should guard my sanctuary and you should guard my Shabbases. Just as Shabbos is a mitzvah that applies throughout time in every generation, so too the mitzvah of revering the sanctuary, which includes not going into the areas where one is forbidden to enter, remains for all time as well. To the extent that the Rambam says that all of the punishments in the Torah for going into an area that you were not allowed to go into, so a Yisrael going into an area where only a Kohen was allowed to, or a person who was Tameh going into an area where they were not allowed to, all of the Torah prohibitions and penalties remain in force, so that if someone who was impure went into the Beis HaMikdash, they would be liable for koreh, spiritual excision. That's the opinion of the Rambam, which is generally accepted as the halacha. However, the Raavad disputes the Rambam, and the Raavad says that there is no koreh because the Kedusha disappeared. Once the temple was destroyed, the holiness was no longer in force, and therefore there is no koreh. The difficulty is that the Raavad should have said that one is allowed to go in there. He doesn't say you're allowed to go. He just says that there is no penalty of koreh. And therefore, in contrast to the Rambam, who says that going into the forbidden areas when one is impure incurs koreh, the Raavad says that it would still be forbidden, either biblically or rabbinically, only that the penalty of koreh does not apply. But then there is a minority opinion that is held by the Meiri, one of the Rishonim, who says that no, nowadays the minhag is that people go up into the Har Habayis, seeming to suggest that the Makam HaMikdash people go up to without any regards to laws of purity and impurity, seemingly of the opinion that all of those laws no longer apply. But the halacha follows the opinion of the Rambam, certainly the Chumrah. We have to be strict when it comes to biblical prohibitions in general, specifically ones that bear the penalty of koreh. So we need to be very, very careful about it and treat it with the highest degree of stringency that the Kedusha did not leave, and therefore all of the penalties for going impure into those areas that one is forbidden would remain in force. So based on that, what would the conclusions be that are relevant nowadays? So me'ikar hadin, one who has tumas meis, which is all of us, as long as they don't have any of the other types of tumah, meaning as long as they've gone to mikvah to take care of the other forms of impurity, then even though we still have tumas meis because we don't have the para aduma, would technically be allowed onto the Har Habayis as long as they stay away from the area which would be the chayil and inwards, the ramparts and the area where the Beis HaMikdash stood itself. And when I say purifying oneself from being a zav or a zava or a nida, balkeri and the like, what does that entail? So it entails going to a kosher mikvah, a fully kosher mikvah that could be used for a woman or for tvilas kelim, made of rainwater, etc. That must be done after waiting the prescribed number of days, depending on the type of impurity that one had. There needs to be the preparation for the mikvah, known as a chafifa, where a person has to cleanse themselves to make sure there's no chatzitza, no interposing substances that would cause a blockage between the water of the mikvah and their body, cutting nails and the like. And then one would go to the mikvah, even a man, a child who was going onto the Temple Mount would go to the mikvah in such a manner, would make a bracha because there is now a mitzvah in that mikvah, and then they would need to guard themselves from the time they go to mikvah till the time of going up onto the Temple Mount to ensure that they don't become impure in the interim. Now, to throw in another issue, that is the concept of a tavul yoim. In biblical times, someone who went to mikvah was not completely pure until the sun set. So they could go to mikveh in the morning, but until the sun set, they had the status of a tavul yoim. And that brought with it certain restrictions that whilst they were allowed on the Har Habayis, they were asur even in the Ezras Nashim, the additional courtyard that was added to Beis HaMikdash. So nowadays, where we have Tumas Mason, we're only allowed on the Har Habayis area anyway. So one could go to mikveh for the other forms of impurity, and even though they were a Tavul Yom, they would be allowed to go up onto the Har Habayis anyway in such a case, as long as they were careful to preserve that purity. So that's in terms of the Tumah. But then we need to identify, well, okay, where are these areas? It was very easy when the Beis Hamikdash was standing and one could see the physical structure, one could see the chel, one could see the walls, one knew exactly where the areas they could or could not go where. But once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we no longer have those markers. So to do some calculations, the Har Habayis, as I mentioned, was 500 by 500 amos. Even though King Herod extended the Har Habayis both to the north and to the south, that did not take on the kedusha of Har Habayis. Only the 500 amos by 500 amos had the kedusha of Har Habayis itself. On the Har Habayis was built the Azara. The Azara was 187 amos in length from east to west and 135 amos across from north to south. In front of that was the Ezras Nashim, which was a square, 135 amos by 135 amos. And around that was the chayil, which went 10 amos to each direction. So when we're talking about someone, for example, at Tumas Meis, they would be allowed on the entire area of Har Habayis, with the exception of that area of where the chayil and the Azara, the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, would have been. Now, the Rambam, based on the Mishnayos, tells us the approximate position of where the Beis Hamikdash would have been on the original Har Habayis of 500 amos by 500 amos. That the Beis Hamikdash was closest to the west side of the Har Habayis. Next, it was closest to the north, then to the east, and it was most distant to the south. So that from the south wall of the Har Habayis to the Azara was the greatest distance. And whilst that might be enough to give us a general idea of where the Beis Hamikdash would have stood, but it's not precise enough for us to make determinations as to where a person may or may not go and risk the potential of kares. And that is certainly so after the Beis Hamikdash was razed to the ground. Not only was it destroyed, but Turnus Rufus plowed the temple to destroy the foundations completely. And therefore, we do not know anymore where exactly the Beis Hamikdash would have stood on the Har Habayis. Nonetheless, there are different theories, some of them from academic scholars, some of them from Rabbanim themselves, as to the tradition of where the Beis Hamikdash was on Har Habayis. And there are 3 or 4 opinions on this, but we'll start with what is considered the halachically accepted basis, and that revolves around the mosque. The golden mosque, which stands on Temple Mount, is called the Dome of the Rock. And the reason it's called the Dome of the Rock is because inside that mosque, you can Google it and see pictures, is a massive, massive rock. It's about 2-3 stories tall. It's a large rock. And the question is, what was that rock? Where was that in terms of the Beis Hamikdash? So when we look at these calculations, we're basing it on Masorah. There was oral tradition that was passed on that this is the particular site of the Beis Hamikdash. There are looking at historical texts like the works of Josephus and others. We look at the topography to determine the site of the Temple Mount, as indeed King David did. Last week in the Parsha, the Pasuk says, "L'shichnai tidrashu basa shama." You have to seek out the place of the Beis Hamikdash, meaning that Hashem did not disclose to us where the Beis Hamikdash would be. It had to be determined through our own efforts and then confirmed by a Navi. So when King David purchased the site of the Beis Hamikdash, he made the cheshbonis. He stayed up an entire night with the book of the Torah and the book of Yeshua, and through using the psukim, deduced the place of the Har Habayis, that it was on the highest point of Yerushalayim, but not at the highest point. It was slightly lower than that highest point. And that's where he determined the site of the Beis Hamikdash. But even that is very difficult nowadays because the topography has changed, as we know. Archaeologists will tell you that there's a constant shift as there's building and destruction. So everything has changed, which makes it very hard to actually place the Beis Hamikdash. So with regards to the theory that the side of the mosque, the side of the rock of the mosque, the question is, which part of the Beis Hamikdash stood over that rock? So many would say that that is the Even HaShasiyah. The Even HaShasiyah, literally translated as the foundation stone, refers to a stone that stuck up 3 finger breadths from the ground of the Har Habayis. It was the bedrock of the mountain. And tradition has it that that was the stone or the site from which the world was created. It's the epicenter of the world. And that was the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That stone, the Even HaShasiyah, was in the Holy of Holies. In the first Beis Hamikdash, the Aron sat on the stone of the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKadoshim of the Even HaShia. But in the second Beis HaMikdash, where we no longer had the Oren, the Even HaShia stood there as a vacant stone. So, as we will see, the Radbaz and most of the halachic authorities tend to view that stone that is currently in the mosque was the stone that stood in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And once we know that, we can work out all of the other measurements to calculate what would have been the area of the Azara, the courtyard, because from the Kodesh HaKadoshim to the end of the courtyard was 11 amos, plus the thickness of the wall, and therefore we could make the calculations. But then there is another theory which says that no, that rock in the Kodesh HaKadoshim was not the Even HaShia, but rather was the site of the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach, it's very interesting. Har Habayis, as the Rambam describes, it was a mountain, but the mountain the retaining wall was built around the mountain, and it was built in such a way of what's called kippin al gabe kippin, rabbinic archways. And that was because of a concern that maybe there were dead bodies or parts of bodies in the ground which confer tumah. So in order to create a barrier between that tumah and the Har Habayis, they built archways which acts like an oil that blocks off the tumah. But the Mizbeach could not be built over the ground that had these archways that were effectively hollow. The Beis HaMikdash had to be fixed to the bedrock. So there is a theory based on the size of the Even HaShia and various other features that maybe that was not the site of the Even HaShia, but the stone in the rock was actually the site of the Mizbeach. So that's one theory. We'll come back to those in a moment. But it all roughly is in the same area. But then there's a theory which is more from academics that said that actually the site of the Beis HaMikdash is not the area of the mosque, but is slightly towards the north, about 100 meters towards the north of where the mosque is. And then there is another theory which sets the site of the Beis HaMikdash to the south of where the mosque is. So those are different ideas, different theories. But we're going to stick with what we call the traditional theory, and that is the one that seems to be endorsed by the poskim, earlier poskim and later poskim, that the site of the mosque is the site of the Har Habayis and of the Beis HaMikdash. And in a way that makes sense, as we know that after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, the nations of the world recognized that this was a holy place, and the Byzantines built a place of worship on the Temple Mount. The Greeks at one stage had a place of worship on the Temple Mount. And we know that the habit of Muslims is to take other people's holy places and claim it for their own. And the idea of having Muslims on the Temple Mount is something which goes back well over 1,000 years, if not longer. And therefore, it's presumable that they built that mosque specifically knowing that that was the site of the Har Habayis, that was the site of the Azara, the site of the Beis HaMikdash. So that is kind of the accepted theory. Interesting, the Radbaz, Reb David ben Zimra, who lived in the 1500s, was asked, he has a number of tshuvas on this topic. He was asked the following question. He was asked, very interesting, if one looks in the halachic literature, Yerushalayim is supposed to be the highest point, and the Beis HaMikdash is supposed to be near to the highest point in Yerushalayim. And one was supposed to be able to see from the Har HaTzoifim, the Mount Scopus, the Mount of Olives, towards the Har Habayis, the Temple Mount. And someone wrote to the Radbaz that nowadays, when we look in Yerushalayim, what we see is the Temple Mount is not that tall. In fact, it's surrounded on three sides by mountaintops that are much taller than it. So how do we reconcile that with Chazal, which says that Har Habayis was almost the tallest point in Yehuda, in the Judean region? And the Rabbah goes through a fascinating discussion. He says a lot's changed since then. A lot happens in 2,000 years, starting from the fact that it was destroyed by the Romans and that they dug down to destroy the foundations. In addition, when buildings are destroyed and trees and the like are uprooted, that gives rise to erosion. The rainfall over time, floods over time, can erode the soil and lower the height of a particular mountain. And he brings a proof in this tshuva from the Even HaShia, from the foundation stone. And he writes that according to Chazal, they tell us that Even HaShia protruded 3 finger breadths above the ground of Har Habayis, only 3 finger breadths. And yet now, says the Radbaz, the non-Jews have told me that the stone actually sticks up 2 stories. And in another tshuva, he writes 3 stories above the ground of the mosque, above the ground of the Har Habayis. So we can see the idea of the erosion of the ground from where it would be to the bottom. And the point we draw from this tshuva of the Radbaz is he is clearly accepting that the stone in the mosque was the Even Hashsia, was the stone of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. He then goes on and adds also, as we know, that not only could Har Habayis have been lowered over time, but the rest of Yerushalayim could be raised up. I was just in Israel a year ago, and when you talk with archaeologists, they say archaeology is about digging through layers, because each subsequent nation to conquer the city would build on top of the rubble of the previous city, who would build on top of the rubble of that and the rubble of that, etc., and eventually becomes raised up. But the Radbaz is very clear in this tshuva that the stone in the rock in the mosque is the rock of the Even Hashasiyah. However, there is another tshuva of the Radbaz in Siman Tov Reish Tzadik Aleph, and it's interesting there. The tshuva there is discussing, it seems that, and we know this, prior to 1967, Muslims had built all the way up against Har Habayis. And the Radbaz writes that not only were the buildings right up against Har Habayis, but there were even porches and buildings that overhung the air space of Har Habayis. And he was asked about the permissibility of going onto these porches that went over the Har Habayis, obviously the concern being one of purity and impurity. And he writes in that tshuva that it is barur b'li safek, it is clear without a doubt that the stone inside the Even Hashis, inside the dome, the kippah, the dome, is, which is called Al-Aqsa, that is the Even Hashasiyah. He says that emphatically, the b'li safek, that is the Even Hashasiyah, and therefore that would be the place of the Holy of Holies. And therefore, but then he says, writes something very strange, which a lot of people struggle with. He says, therefore, any of these galleries or porches that go over on the west side of the Har Habayis, if they go within 11 amos of the site of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, they are problematic. And then he writes that the gate, which is the gate of the Temple Mount, which is closest to the Makom of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, is a gate known as the Bab al-Katan, which means the cotton maker's gate, because it led to the cotton market. And he writes there that, well, it's recorded there. He doesn't write this. It's recorded that Jews would go and gather there because that was the closest place you could go to where the Kodesh HaKadoshim was. And Jews would go there, they would gather, and they would daven. Now, the truth is seemingly based on what the Radbaz is saying, and it's very strange because the mosque is far more than 11 amos away from the western wall of the Temple Mount. And therefore, it's very hard to understand what the Radbaz is talking about. But in the end of his tshuva, he basically says that, you know what, I have seen and I've been told that the gate, from the gate of the Har Habayis to the mosque, is way more than the 11 amos. And therefore, he writes there is no problem in going to these galleries, going into these porticos. But again, we see from the Radbaz the acceptance that in terms of the position of Har Habayis, the position of the Azara and the Beis and the Mishkan, the Beis Hamikdash, was where the area of the Dome of the Rock was. So now we know about the laws of Tumah and Tahara, that a person who has Tumah's mace is allowed on the Har Habayis as long as they've been to mikveh for the other types of Tumah, but they are not allowed into any area which could be the area where the Azara, the Chayil, and the Beis Hamikdash stood. And now, based on this, we have an approximate idea of what that was. And just to point out, and again, we'll come to practical halacha in a moment, but the groups that go up according to halacha make sure to stay well away from anywhere that would possibly be where the Azara was. And therefore, they stick to the perimeter. They stick to the walls, really, of the Har Habayis to go around. Now, before we move on, I just want to share one very interesting shitta, which is very, very strange. And that is brought in the Igros Moshe. The Igros Moshe, Rav Moshe Feinstein, in Orach Chaim Chelek Beis, Siman Kuf Yud Gimel, writes about what we call the Koisel Amaravi, the Western Wall. Now, back then, they didn't know how far the Western Wall went. Today, with the Koisel tunnels, we know that it goes very far, and it's kind of accepted fact, not disputed, that the Koisel was not the wall of the Azara, was not the wall of the Beis Hamikdash, but was the retaining wall of the mountain itself. It was the retaining wall of the Har Habayis. But the Igros Moshe there writes, the Ulai, maybe it's not so clear which Koisel the Koisel is. That maybe it is, like our tradition, the western wall of Har Habayis, in which case there's no problem for someone with tumas mace to go there. But maybe it is the wall of the Azara. Maybe the Koisel is the wall at the back on the western side of the Beis Hamikdash itself. In which case, someone who had tumas mace would not be allowed to go to the area of the Koisel. And then he writes that perhaps this is the reason of the Griz, the Goin of Brisk, that they say about him that he never went to the Koisel. Even though he lived in Yerushalayim, he never went to the Koisel Ma'aravi because of a concern of Tumah. So there is this minority view that the Koisel is not the Har Habayis wall, but rather the wall of the Azara. That's not accepted because otherwise we would not be able to go up to the Koisel. Generally speaking, Rav Moshe himself writes that many people argue with that view, and that's not kind of the accepted position. In terms of other halachas, the one has to be wary of when going up onto Har Habayis. The Rambam goes through these halachas. There are limitations. Number one is only allowed to go up for a mitzvah. One is not allowed to go up to Har Habayis for a shmooze with someone. One's not allowed to use it as a shortcut. One can only go up for a mitzvah, to bring a korban, to worship there, to bow down, etc. That would be the reason. When one is on Har Habayis, they're not allowed to act in way of kalus rosh. They're not allowed to act in a light-headed manner. They have to have serious reverence and focus. In terms of the garments, one is not allowed to go up onto Har Habayis carrying a stick. One is not allowed to go with without a overshirt. One can't just go up with an undershirt on. One cannot go up wearing leather shoes, just like on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. And therefore, one could go up either barefoot or nowadays with rubber and synthetic shoes. One should not go out with a money pouch that's exposed, so that would be a wallet and the like. And there's lots of discussions about the appropriateness of taking phones and cameras and things like that as well. Okay, so now let's come to the halachic controversy, because based on what we've said, it seems that there should not really be a halachic problem of going up onto Har Habayis. As long as a person has gone to mikveh in the proper manner, and that takes care of the tumah of Azav, Azava, and Nida, Yoledas, and the like. Then even though we have tumas mace, as long as one stays in the area which is only the status of Har Habayis, not going anywhere near the area where the Azara could have or would have been, then technically there should not be a problem. And indeed, there are historical precedents of great rabbis and chachamim, or people from the time of the Churban, going up onto the Har Habayis itself. Nonetheless, the minhag at some point in time, and here we're talking about going back hundreds of years, and that is the accepted position of the Gedolei HaPoskim, is that we don't go up to Har Habayis at all. Even if one is careful to stay out of certain areas, we don't go up at all. And we'll look through just a few of the responses, starting with Rav Ovadia Yosef in the Tshuvas of Yechavedas, Chelek Aleph, Siman Chaf Hey. And there he writes that it is asur behechlet b'dman hazeh. It is categorically forbidden nowadays, because we all have tumas mace, and someone who has tumas mace who goes into a forbidden area is chayev kares, just like the Rambam writes. Then he writes that someone who is matir, someone who is permissive and allows people to go up onto Har Habayis, is causing a takala. They are causing a stumbling block to fellow Jews, because whilst they might be careful, fellow Jews will see them. They don't know the halachas, and they don't know the laws of purity and the restrictions of where to go, and they could very easy to go further into the compound of the Beis Hamikdash and be subject to an isur kares. Furthermore, most of the poskim accepted that we don't go up onto Har Habayis. Now, what's very interesting is he quotes a tshuva from the previous generation about a rabbi in the old yeshuv of Yerushalayim who wanted to go up onto Har Habayis, or wanted to institute the practice of going up onto Har Habayis. But the great rabbanim of the old yeshuv came out strongly against that. And amongst them were the Toras Chesed, who has a connection to Chabad, who was a Lubavitcher Chassid, Reb Shner Zalman Fradkin, known as the Toras Chesed of Lublin, and the Rav of Yerushalayim, Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, was categorically against going up to Har Habayis, and they said that this rabbi who wanted to allow it, was a choite umachtias harabim. The words of the sages, that he himself is a sinner and he causes others to sin. And there was a question whether to put him in nidui, whether to put an excommunication on him. Ovadia Yosef, and we'll come back to this, addresses something written in a letter from the Rambam, Maimonides, which seems to suggest that the Rambam went up onto Har Habayis. We're going to come to that in a moment. But that's the opinion of Ovadia Yosef, saying that is categorically forbidden. The next shuva on the topic is from the Minchas Yitzchak in Chelak Hey Siman Aleph, where he also discusses this pirza, that post 67 there is now this breach that people are going up onto Har Habayis, even ones who go in a way of purity of going to a mikveh. This is a breach of the established custom and is halachically problematic. Now he writes that they want to base themselves on the Rambam, who seems to suggest that one would be allowed to go up to certain areas on Har Habayis. And the Rambam in his letter seems to indicate that he himself went up onto Har Habayis, but he writes, "Be'emes ein heter klal." Even though halachically, technically, there should be an allowance to be able to go if one has gone to mikveh and stays out of the restricted off-limits areas. Nonetheless, the Minchas Yitzchak goes through a number of reasons why nowadays that is not applicable and we should not be relying on that, because the laws of purity and impurity and immersion are very, very complex, and therefore we don't want to risk going into the areas of the temple when we are impure. Number one, he brings this as follows. Until now, we said that a Tvul Yoim, someone who's been to mikveh in the morning, but it hasn't yet passed sunset, is only forbidden from the Ezras Nashim, but would be allowed on the rest of Har Habayis. That is the view of the Rambam. Rashi, however, is of the view that a Tvul Yoim is forbidden anywhere on Har Habayis, which would mean that if someone wanted to go onto Har Habayis, they went to mikveh in the morning, they would not be allowed onto Har Habayis until the sun is set. And between going to mikveh and the sun setting, a lot could happen, aside from the fact that the Temple Mount is not open for access during the night. What are the concerns? So even after a person's gone to mikveh, it's possible for them to become impure again. For example, if a person urinated and there were still traces of impurity in their body, which inside the body doesn't cause impurity, but once it comes out, could cause impurity. And that would effectively mean that after going to mikveh, before going onto the Temple Mount, and according to Rashi, that means waiting till evening, one would not be able to go to the bathroom at all. And that's something very, very difficult to be careful. Furthermore, he writes that nowadays we are not baki, we are not expert in the laws of purity and impurity. Back in temple times, everyone was baki, everyone was fluent in these halachas, because for them it was day-to-day, run-of-the-mill. They went to the Beis HaMikdash frequently, going to mikveh was a frequent habit, and therefore they were expert in these laws, the laws of purity and purity, and being careful to stay away from things that make one impure. But we are not expert in those laws. Yes, we do have mikveh, and we use mikveh, but we are not proficient in the laws of what makes a person impure or not. And therefore, we have to err on the side of caution, and in addition, we have the doubts of where the areas of the Har Habayis are. In contrast, we have Rav Goren, as I mentioned before, who says not only is one allowed to go up onto Har Habayis, but it's a mitzvah to do so. He writes that it's a mitzvah to go onto Har Habayis, and he based that on a very interesting halacha. The halacha says that when they need to make repairs in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, this is the Holy of Holies, where only the Kohen Gadol was allowed to go on Yom Kippur, but if they needed to make repairs and they couldn't find a Kohen or a pure person to do the repairs, they were even allowed to send someone who was impure to do the repairs because it was for the sake of the Beis HaMikdash. Based on that, Rav Goren says that nowadays the same would apply. That being that our control over Har Habayis is in jeopardy, and the nations of the world are trying to take it away from us, in order to preserve our hold over it, we need to go up onto Har Habayis. And even if a person was impure, he suggests that that would be okay because it's for the sake of the Beis HaMikdash. As is understood, this opinion is very much considered outside of the pale. Recently, I just came across a response from the Rebbe about the issue of going up onto Har Habayis. The Rebbe was of the view one should certainly not go up onto Har Habayis, not because per se there aren't, that one could circumvent the halachic issues by going to mikveh and staying out of certain areas, but the Rebbe's concern, much like that of Ovadia Yosef, is the impact for other people. Because whilst we as religious people might know and therefore be careful of the halachas, other people do not know that. All they do is they see religious people going up onto the Temple Mount. They don't know that we've been to mikveh. They don't know that we've counted the right days. They don't know that we've made a proper preparation for the mikveh, chafifa and the like. They don't know that we're staying out of certain areas. And it's very easy to cause others to sin. And we know that there is an idea of lifnei iver lo sita michshol, not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, not to cause a takala to others. And therefore, even if we were sure, and that's a big if, that we could observe the halachas fully, we need to be considerate of the impact that others will have. And unfortunately, today, the reality is many of the people who go up on Har Habayis don't follow the halachas at all, and will go right into the mosque, which, according to Radbaz, is the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, and Isser Kares. And they point and they say, well, look, religious Jews are going up. Why can't we? So that was the Rebbe's view. And finally, to conclude, just to look at some historical precedents with regards to going up onto the Har Habayis post-destruction of the temple. It seems that throughout the time, from the Churban Beis HaMikdash until, for the next few 1,500 years at least, there were descriptions in various sources of Jews going up onto the Har Habayis Temple Mount. We already saw the Meiri. The Meiri writes that the minhag is that people do go up onto Har Habayis, onto the Temple Mount, suggesting that it was a completely acceptable and permissible practice. What's fascinating is that about 50 years after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, King Hadrian was a horrible character. He was cruel and sadistic, etc. But it's recorded that he gave permission for the Jewish people to build a house of worship on the Temple Mount, but for various reasons it did not continue. This is referenced in the Medrash Rabbah in Bereshis, which says that in the times of Yoshua ben Hananiah, the Malchus Harisha, the evil regime, the Romans, decreed that they should build a Beis Hamikdash, or they could build a Beis Hamikdash. And whilst there's discussion whether that means a Beis Hamikdash or that it's something else, but nonetheless, that seems to suggest that there was permission granted, but because of internal rifts amongst the Jewish people and the Kutziim, that fell apart. Going a little bit further forward, about 360 of the Common Era, the Caesar Julian decreed that there should be freedom of religion, and he promised to allow the building of a building on the site of Har Habayis. He gave money towards that as well, and again, that never came through. There are other accounts later until finally we come to the Caliph Omar, who was the mosque, the builder of the mosque, 640 of the Common Era. He gave permission to the Jewish people to be able to daven, to worship on Har Habayis. And there are those who say that he gave permission to build a wooden structure, a shul, on the Har Habayis. Obviously, that would have been built in an area where it was permission to go to. There are references in Karaite writings that mention about a Jewish house of worship on the Temple Mount. Then we come to the Rambam, and here's where we get very interesting. The Rambam writes a letter about his trip to Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam took a boat from Egypt. He comes to Akko, to the port, and then he travels from there on donkey to Yerushalayim. He describes his journey in a letter, and he describes how on the 6th day of Mar Cheshvan, he came and he davened Babayis Hagadol v'Hakodesh. He davened in the great and holy house. And many people say that this is referring, well, it's obviously not referring to Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, but that is a term that we use to refer to the Beis Hamikdash in benching. We say Habayis Hagadol v'Hakodesh shenikra shimcha alav. So there are those who suggest, whilst it doesn't mean the Beis Hamikdash, but maybe it means this wooden shul, this shul that was on the Har Habayis. But many others, including the Minchas Yitzchak and Avadia Yosef, negate that and say that no, it means a shul that was built close to, but not on the Har Habayis. The Radbaz writes about that people would go into certain areas where it was clear that it was not part of the Hazara. The Meiri we already saw. The Ramban, it's also alleged to have gone up into Har Habayis. In fact, it's a very interesting story about how he was wandering through the cities. It's not like today where things are very well marked, but back then you've got these narrow alleyways winding everywhere. And he came to a point where he was going to enter a gate, and a Muslim, an Arab guard, stopped him and said that this is the site of the Temple Mount, and you can't go in. But it is again suggested the Ramban himself went up onto the Har Habayis. So in terms of the halachic outcome, whilst we've looked at various sources that seem to suggest that there is scope for going up onto the Har Habayis nowadays, if one made the proper preparations, and even though we have tumas mates, as long as one stays clear of the area where the Azara would have been, there technically should be no problem. But we see that the Chachamim, the rabbis, certainly in the last few hundred years, made a siyag, made protective enactments or protective rulings to prevent people coming to violate the laws of the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash, especially that it's actually severe. And in fact, our sages say that the non-Jews did not treat the Beis HaMikdash with irreverence or treat it lightly until the Jewish people treated it lightly. That's the Sefer Chassidim. The Sefer Chassidim says that the non-Jews only treated the Beis HaMikdash lightly when we failed to give it the proper respect that is due to it. And therefore, the rabbis made these kind of protected status quo that we don't go up onto Har Habayis because it could lead others to sin, and we even unintentionally could come to that situation as well. Nonetheless, we know that Be'ezras Hashem, Mashiach will come, and then we will have the 10th Para Aduma, which the Rambam writes about in the laws of Para Aduma, and then we'll be able to remove all types of impurity, and including the impurity of the Tumas Meis, contact with the dead, and then we'll certainly be able to be allowed to go up to the Har Habayis. Now, it should be really the desire that every Jew has is to go to the Beis HaMikdash. That's one of the interpretations of the words, L'shichnoi sidrashu, that it was not only about the time when they were building the Beis HaMikdash, but it's a perpetual mitzvah. It's a perpetual call to seek out, to yearn for, to long for the shichnoi, the place where Hashem's Shekhinah will rest, which is in Yerushalayim, on Har Moriah, in the Beis HaMikdash. And in the schutz of our learning about the Beis HaMikdash, in the schutz of our yearning to be able to go to the Beis HaMikdash, we should be able to have the third Beis HaMikdash. We should be able to have the ultimate purification of Zarakti Aleichem Mayim Tahoid Mutartem, that Hashem will purify all of us and purify the entire world. And then we'll be able to go into the third Beis HaMikdash, into all of the areas where we are allowed to go. And we'll be able to bring korbanos kamitzvos of Tzenecha, and it should happen. B'mei Rabbi Ameinu, Amen. Okay, if there are any questions. Okay, well, thank you for joining us for our shir tonight, and look forward to having other